It is time for the Holy War. BYU and Utah getting it on Saturday night. We bring in Shane Roberts from Block U to help us set it up. And Shane, we can go through the nuts and bolts, the X's and O's, but there's a different element when we're talking about this kind of rivalry. So before we start to talk personnel and what happened last week and how it may translate, you got to give our viewers a feel for what this is all about, because I grew up as a college football fanatic and I knew about the rivalry, but until I started talking to guys like you, I didn't really understand it.
Well, it's an interesting rivalry for sure on a whole lot of levels. The two campuses are about 40 minutes apart. Utah and Salt Lake City, BYU down in Provo. Um, it's a rivalry not unlike a lot of them, Ohio State, Michigan, stuff like that, that can really divide families as well. Since it's within the same state, it's, like I said, 40 minutes up the freeway from one another. Families, commingle, friends, high school buddies, spouses. You'll have a BYU husband slash wife or vice versa. So you can really have split households. But the really unique thing about it that, a lot of people point out is obviously BYU is owned and run by the Mormon Church, the LDS Church. So there's the state versus religious school aspect to it. So obviously Utah's full of drunken heathens that they can't keep their beer to themselves, just pouring beer on everybody, versus the uptight religious, holier than thou mentality of BYU fans. So it's a really interesting dynamic that really divides. And kind of the ultimate ironic thing is Kyle Whittingham and most of his staff are Mormon. A good chunk of the players on Utah's rosters, LDS. A lot of the fan base is LDS, and you kind of get the interesting dynamic to where a lot of those Mormon fans and players, they really come to resent BYU because BYU finds themselves as they perceive themselves as the superior religious institution, when a lot of the religious players on the team kind of take exception to that. And that's not just around at Utah. I remember this past weekend there was a player at Arizona. Arizona has a large contingent of LDS players, and he says he hates BYU for that reason alone. Now, I might be, been in that just a little bit, but that's paraphrasing basically what he says, and that's very similar kind of around the region, along the West Coast. And so the religious aspect, ties a lot of, brings things to a whole different level. Over the past 10 years with Bronco Mendenhall at the helm, him and Kyle Whittingham haven't really gotten along at all. It's very much water and oil. They just don't mix. Where the previous coaches, Ron McBride and Lavelle Edwards, were buddies. They were pals. They still are to this day. They have a lot of fun with one another. So it went from very friendly coaching relationship to very cold. That's probably the best way to put it. Now BYU's head coach is Kalani Sitake, who is also, he played at BYU, but he was also Utah's defensive coordinator, and he was up at Utah as a coach for about 10 years. And him and Kyle are very, very close friends. So now the relationship is changing again to being a little bit more friendly. And the feel around the game this year is definitely a little bit different, at least in terms of the way I perceive it, because generally there's just unbridled hatred. Now it feels to me like it's cooling quite a bit, just because Kalani's such a likable guy. He's very respectful, specifically to the opposing fans, and obviously spending as much time up at Utah as he did, he really has a different perspective on the whole thing.
Fascinating. So we don't have to go too far back in the rivalry in the series. 2 games ago, all of last December in the Las Vegas Bowl, a game in which BYU could do nothing right in the first quarter. Everything turned Utah's way. You guys were able to hold on to a huge lead and hang on for the victory in a pretty hotly contested game, as it turned out. Again, it was all Utah early, a lot of turnovers, and BYU came storming back, but couldn't quite get there. So, what stands out in regards to your memories of the series? What games were excruciating? What games, on the other hand, were exhilaration for you?
Yeah. Well, the series, frankly, has been one-sided over the last 15 years. Utah's won 5 straight. We've won, I want to say, probably like 9 of 12. So it's been pretty one-sided, really, since probably the beginning of the Urban Meyer years up at Utah. But some of the most exhilarating ones, a couple that jump out to me positively, would be the 2004, the 2003 and 2004 games. 2003, Utah shut out BYU for the first time that BYU hadn't scored in something like 20 or 30 years. So that was a big one down in Provo. That was Urban Meyer's first season. The second year, up in Salt Lake, Utah just absolutely demolished BYU to clinch a perfect season and go to the Fiesta Bowl, the initial BCS Busters. Alex Smith, the whole 9 yards, just ran over him. Couple heartbreaks. One heartbreak in particular was about 2 seasons later. Utah stormed back to take the lead against BYU. All the BYU fans will remember this positively, and all Utah fans negatively, of course. Utah storms back, takes the lead with about a minute and a half remaining. Former BYU quarterback John Beck leads BYU down the field. Gets into within scoring range with 6 seconds remaining. I don't remember the exact time, and Utah goes into this crazy defense, and it confused Beck for basically the last year and a half. And then he just had so much time that he was able to run around in the backfield that eventually he just chucked the ball across his body across the field and found a wide open guy in the corner of the end zone and snapped what was then a 4-game losing streak to Utah. Utah had that sucker in the bag, but they just couldn't bring him down. A year later, again, Utah had it in the bag. Had BYU at 4th and 18, pinned back on their own, I want to say 15, 20-yard line. It was 4th and 18, like I said. For some reason, one of Utah's corners decided to come up and try to make a play on the quarterback who was scrambling. He had nowhere to go and left his guy, Austin Collie, wide open, running down the sideline to pick up probably about 40 or 50 yards and eventually scored the game-winning touchdown. And then one of the most memorable ones that probably a lot of people around the country remember just a couple years ago, Utah handled BYU pretty heavily throughout most of the game, but BYU again rallied and stormed back. And they actually got in position to kick a field goal to, I can't remember if it was a tie or to win the game, one or the other. But they kicked it, and it was blocked. Fans stormed the field. Officials throw the flag for the fans storming the field, so they kick it again. So they blocked once, they kick it again. I can't remember the exact series of events, but basically BYU had basically 3 chances to tie or win the game, and they missed or failed all 3 times, and the crowd rushed the field 3 times. So it was basically a record broken for the amount of times that fans stormed the field. So that was a big one. So, I mean, you can go pretty much any game and find just something crazy or zany, as is pretty custom for a lot of rivalry games. The game didn't happen 2 years ago, which is something that hasn't happened since, I think, World War II. So it's kind of had an interesting series of late.
I love the history. Hearing about it, I remember some of those moments, not all of them. So I can talk college football history all day, but we'll bring it back to what's going to take place on Saturday night. 2 really good football teams, BYU and Utah. Of course, you guys got off to a 24-0 win in your opener against Southern Utah. So to hit a few key points here, of course, we've been awaiting the play of Troy Williams at quarterback. He did some good things in the passing game on 20 of 35. So your thoughts about the passing attack and Williams in particular?
Yeah, Troy looked really, really good the other night. The passing attack is much more aggressive. They went downfield pretty much right away. They were attacking deep early and often. They didn't connect as many times as we'd like them to see it connect, but for a first game, they had an early reception of about 52 yards to set them up for their first field goal, which should have been a touchdown. And then late in the game for their last score, it was a 56-yard bomb for a touchdown. So Troy looked very, very good, very poised in the pocket. His offensive line wasn't particularly good in the game. They were pretty up and down. They'd have a good series and they'd have a bad series, and just things just weren't quite gelling like we'd like to see. But Troy did a good job on third and longs. He was stuck in third and long quite a bit. He had the ability to keep the chains moving, finding the open guy. He's also very good at scrambling. He was one of the top-rated dual-threat quarterbacks in the country a couple years for a reason. So he did a very good job keeping the chains moving. He just has a really good presence on the field. I think that's the one thing I really noticed about him was he was on the field. You knew who the guy was, and there was really no question about it. So throwing for 270-plus yards and 2 scores in his first start, not much more I could have asked for out of the guy, to be honest with you.
Joe Williams was the guy in relief of Devontae Booker at the end of last year. But so Troy McCormick splits carries with him in the opener, 12 attempts per player. Does that tell us anything about what's going to happen going forward?
Well, Joe really struggled the other night. He kind of got things going in one series. Obviously, the stats, the 50-plus yards he got on the attempts, but he just really had a hard time getting going. He was getting tackled over the line of scrimmage quite a bit. The line wasn't helping him out a ton. He really started to get going on one series. And how did he end that series? He fumbled the ball. And that's the moment that you kind of could feel him really going to the doghouse. Now, going into this week, he's still atop the depth chart, so it sounds like they're going to really give him another chance. We'll see once the game time comes, but Troy McCormick looked great. He was elusive. He was slippery. He was really hard to bring down. He's a smaller guy than Joe Williams, but he just runs so much more violently. He had another 55 yards receiving, so he had 110 yards total on the game. He looked really good coming back from his torn ACL. It was just he looked like the starting running back to me and to many people. So it'll be interesting going up against BYU. Who runs out with the first team? It might be Joe. It might be Troy. We'll find out more, but ultimately it's going to come down to the offensive line and how well they perform to see which guy really separates himself.
Tanner Mangum, of course, was a bit of a Cinderella story for BYU at quarterback last year, coming back from his mission and throwing the Hail Mary against Nebraska in the opener, another Hail Mary against Boise State, putting together a nice season with 23 touchdown passes. Now, Taysom Hill, it seems like for about the 18th time, has reclaimed his job as starting quarterback. I don't know if you had a chance to see the Arizona game. I caught the fourth quarter. It was an extremely exciting game despite a low score for much of the game. The two teams got it going and it went back and forth. And, of course, BYU clinched it with a game-winning field goal. So based on what you saw out at the Utes on Saturday and what you know about your personnel versus what you know about the Cougars in defeating a pretty good Arizona team, any concerns, anything stand out that you'd like to see happen on Saturday night?
Offensively, in terms of Utah, they just need to shore up the offensive line. They do that, I think they'll be fine. BYU and Kalani Sitake, they're going to bring some heat and they're going to come after Utah quite a bit. And if the line doesn't perform, then they're going to have a hard time moving the ball. I think Troy can beat the corners on the outside. Troy Williams, I think he can beat the corners on the outside. BYU, they've traditionally not had the best corners. They've just had a hard time recruiting in that area, just based off of the institution. So I think Utah can pop some big ones on him. I think Troy McCormick can be quite a nightmare for him because he's really fast and really elusive. But I expect BYU to have a pretty good chance of slow things down. And this is going to be a slug match. It's what's going to be. It's not going to be a high-scoring game at all. Taysom Hill, for as much love as he's gotten over the years, I don't know if he's a very good quarterback. Now, he's a great elite athlete. Don't get me wrong. I think he'd be an elite safety. I really do. I think he is an NFL safety. He's built like a brick house. So dude's a stud. But in terms of when it comes to throwing the ball, I'd have to look up his overall stats, but I would be surprised if they're much over 50% completion percentage. The dude has a cannon, but he just doesn't. He's had a hard time developing touch. So if I'm Utah, I take away the running game completely. Jamal Williams is a great running back. He's as good as they get out there, and he might be a name that a lot of fans should know better. He's hard to bring down. He's a really good running back. So if I'm Utah, I load the box and I say, Taysom, try to beat me with your arm. They did that a couple seasons ago. The last regular season they had with him, and he couldn't do it. He had about 100 yards rushing. Now he only had probably about a dozen or so against Arizona. The question is, will Ty Detmer try to open that up a little bit more against Utah? I don't know. Now, Utah defensively is an entirely different beast than Arizona. Arizona arguably might have the worst defense in the Pac-12. Utah they're a top 2 or 3 defense. There's no question in my mind. So it's going to be a slugfest. This is going to be one of those 21-17 type of games. There's going to be a lot of punts. There's going to be a lot of field position battles. But ultimately, what it comes down to is, I think you'll be hard pressed to find anybody on either side of the ball that will disagree that Utah has got the more talent from top to bottom. The roster, just Utah's got a lot more than BYU. But this is also, and a lot of people, I don't know how often people's talked about this, but BYU's head coach, offensive coordinator, and defensive coordinator, this is their first years all in their respective positions. This is Kyle Whittingham's 12th, and his appropriate staff and whatnot. They are all very, very experienced, not only in this game, but in their various positions. Obviously, defensive coordinator, Morgan Scalley, this is his first year, but he's been within the system for 20 years or whatever. He's been up at the hill practically. So there's going to be a lot of emotions, a lot of changes, a lot of coaching chess going on, and I give the advantage to Utah on that as well, just based off of experience. And of course, the game's at home at Rice Eccles Stadium. I just don't expect Utah to lose at home with better players, with better coaching, more experienced coaching at minimum. At home, I just don't see that.
Yeah, you mentioned Jamal Williams. He's another guy that it seems as though he's been at BYU for a decade. He's had his injury issues. I heard a stat the other day that he and Taysom Hill have started 4 openers for BYU together, but they're not 4 consecutive openers. They might be spaced by maybe not even 5, but 6 years. I'd have to look into that. But yeah, not 4 consecutive seasons with your starting running back and quarterback because of issues with injuries. But yeah, 2 very interesting players. I would give the same analysis of Taysom Hill. Extraordinary athlete. He might be doing himself a disservice by not playing another position, and safety would seem to be the right fit for him. BYU, Utah, this is a national game, so it's 5:30 local time, 7:30 Eastern time on Fox, so the nation can see it and see the Utes and the Cougars go at it in one of the better rivalries in college football. Shane Roberts from the Block U helping us set the stage for it. Shane, we always appreciate the look.
Thanks as always, Mark.